Chapter 39 of Will Warburton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Will Warburton by George Gissing. Chapter 39. The garden was drenched in dew, and when about 7 o'clock the first sunbeam pierced the grey mantle of the east, every leaf flashed back the yellow light. Will was walking there alone, his eyes turned now and then to the white window of his mother's room. Jane came forth with her rosy morning face, her expression graver than of wont. "You are uneasy about mother," were her first words. "So am I, very. I feel convinced Dr. Edge has given her some serious warning. I saw the change in her after his last visit." "I shall go and see him," said Will. They talked of their anxiety, then Warburton proposed that they should walk a little way along the road, for the air was cool. "I've something I want to tell you," he began, when they had set forth. "It's a little startling, rather ludicrous too. What should you say if someone came and told you he had seen me serving behind a grocer's counter in London?" "What do you mean, Will?" "Well, I want to know how it would strike you. Should you be horrified?" "No, but astonished." "Very well. The fact of the matter is, then," said Warburton with an uneasy smile, "that for a couple of years I have been doing that. It came about in this way." He related Godfrey Sherwood's reckless proceedings and the circumstances which had decided him to take a shop. No exclamation escaped the listener. She walked with eyes downcast, and, when her brother ceased, looked at him very gently, affectionately. "It was brave of you, Will," she said. "Well, I saw no other way of making good the loss, but now I am sick of living a double life. That has really been the worst part of it all along. What I want to ask you is, would it be wise or not to tell mother? Would it worry and distress her? As for the money, you see there's nothing to worry about. The shop will yield a sufficient income, though not as much as we hoped from Applegarth's. But of course I shall have to go on behind the counter." He broke off laughing, and Jane smiled, though with a line of trouble on her brow. "That won't do," she said with quiet decision. "Oh, I'm getting used to it. No, Will, it won't do. We must find a better way. I see no harm in shopkeeping, if one has been brought up to it. But you haven't, and it isn't suitable for you. About mother, yes, I think we'd better tell her. She won't worry on account of the money. That isn't her nature, and it's very much better that there should be confidence between us all." "I haven't enjoyed telling lies," said Will, "I assure you." "That I'm sure you haven't, poor boy. But Mr. Sherwood, hasn't he made any effort to help you? Surely he—" "Poor old Godfrey," broke in her brother, laughing. "It's a joke to remember that I used to think him a splendid man of business, far more practical than I. Why, there's no dreamier muddlehead living." He told the stories of Strangwyn and of Milligan with such exuberance of humour that Jane could not but join in his merriment. No, it's no good looking in that direction. The money has gone. There's no help for it. But you can depend on Jollymans. Of course, the affair would have been much more difficult without Alchin. Oh, you must see Alchin some day." "And absolutely no one has discovered the secret?" asked Jane. Will hesitated then. "Yes, one person. You remember the name of Miss Elvin? A fortnight ago, imagine the scene. She walked into the shop with a friend of hers, a Miss Cross, who has been one of my customers from the first. As soon as she caught sight of me, she turned and ran. Yes, ran out into the street in indignation and horror. Of course, she must have told her friend, and whether Miss Cross will ever come to the shop again, I don't know. I never mentioned that name to you, did I? The Crosses were friends of Norbert Franks. And, by the by, I hear that Franks was married to Miss Elvin a few days ago, just after her awful discovery. No doubt she told him, and perhaps he'll drop my acquaintance." don't mean that." "Well, not quite, but it wouldn't surprise me if his wife told him that really one mustn't be too intimate with grocers. In future, I'm going to tell everybody. There shall be no more hiding and sneaking. That's what debases a man, not the selling of sugar and tea. A short time ago I had got into a vile state of mind. I felt like poisoning myself, and I'm convinced it was merely the burden of lies weighing upon me. Yes, you are quite right. Of course, Mother must be told. Shall I leave it to you, Jane? I think you could break it better." After breakfast, Will walked into St. Neots to have a private conversation with Dr. Edge, and whilst he was away, Jane told her mother the story of the lost money. At the end of an hour's talk, she went out into the garden, where presently she was found by her brother, who had walked back at his utmost pace, and wore a perturbed countenance. "You haven't told yet?" were his first words, uttered in a breathless undertone. "Why?" asked Jane, startled. "I'm afraid of the result. Edge says that every sort of agitation must be avoided." "I have told her," said Jane, with quiet voice but anxious look. "She was grieved on your account, but it gave her no shock. Again and again she said how glad she was you had let us know the truth." "So far, then, good." "But Dr. Edge, what did he tell you?" "He said he had wanted to see me and thought of writing. Yes, he speaks seriously." They talked for a little while. Then Will went into the house alone and found his mother as she sat in her wonted place, the usual needlework on her lap. As he crossed the room, she kept her eyes upon him in a gaze of the gentlest reproach, mingled with a smile, which told the origin of Will's wholesome humour. "And you couldn't trust me to take my share of the trouble?" "I knew only too well," replied her son, "that your own share wouldn't content you." "Greedy mother! Perhaps you were right, Will. I suppose I should have interfered and made everything worse for you. But you needn't have waited quite so long before telling me. The one thing that I can't understand is Mr. Sherwood's behaviour. You've always given me such a different idea of him. Really, I don't think he ought to have been let off so easily." "Oh, poor old Godfrey! What could he do? He was sorry as man could be, and he gave me all the cash he could scrape together." "Glad he wasn't a friend of mine," said Mrs. Warburton. "In all my life I have never quarrelled with a friend, but I'm afraid I must have fallen out with Mr. Sherwood. Think of the women who entrust their all to men of that kind, and have no strong son to save them from the consequences." After the midday meal all sat together for an hour or two in the garden. By an evening train Will returned to London. Jane had promised to let him have frequent news, and during the ensuing week she wrote twice with very favourable accounts of their mother's condition. A month went by without any disquieting report. Then came a letter in Mrs. Warburton's own hand. "My dear Will," she wrote, "I can't keep secrets as long as you. This is to inform you that a week ago I let the Hawes on annual tenancy to a friend of Mr. Turnbull's who was looking for such a house. The day after tomorrow we begin our removal to a home which Jane has taken, near to Miss Winter's in Suffolk. That she was able to find just what we wanted at a moment's notice encourages me in thinking that Providence is on our side, or, as your dear father used to say, that the oracle has spoken. In a week's time I hope to send news that we are settled. You are forbidden to come here before our departure, but will be invited to the new home as soon as possible. The address is, etc." The same post brought a letter from Jane. "Don't be alarmed by the news," she wrote. "Mother has been so firm in this resolve since the day of your leaving us that I could only obey her. Wonderful and delightful to tell, she seems better in health. I dare not make too much of this, after what Dr. Edge said, but for the present she is certainly stronger. As you suppose, I am going to work with Miss Winter. Come and see us when we are settled, and you shall hear all our plans. Everything has been done so quickly that I live in a sort of a dream. Don't worry, and of course don't on any account come." These letters arrived in the evening, and after reading them, Warburton was so moved that he had to go out and walk under the starry sky in quiet streets. Of course, the motive on which his mother had acted was a desire to free him as soon as possible from the slavery of the shop. But that slavery had now grown so supportable that he grieved over the sacrifice made for his sake. After all, would he not have done better to live on with his secret? And yet... End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of Will Warburton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Will Warburton by George Gissing. Chapter 40. With curiosity, which had in it a touch of amusement, Will was waiting to hear from Norbert Franks. He waited for nearly a month, and was beginning to feel rather hurt at his friend's neglect, perhaps a little uneasy on another score, when there arrived an Italian postcard, stamped Venice. "We have been tempted as far as this," ran the hurried scrawl. "Must be home in 10 days. Shall be delighted to see you again." Warburton puckered his brows, and wondered whether a previous letter or card had failed to reach him. But probably not. At the end of September, Franks wrote from his London address, briefly but cordially, with an invitation to luncheon on the next day, which was Sunday. And Warburton went. He was nervous as he knocked at the door. He was rather more nervous as he walked into the studio. Norbert advanced to him with a shout of welcome, and from a chair in the background rose Mrs. Franks. Perceptibly changed, both of them. The artist's look was not quite so ingenuous as formerly. His speech, resolute in friendliness, had not quite the familiar note. Rosamond, already more mature of aspect, smiled somewhat too persistently, seemed rather too bent on showing herself unembarrassed. They plunged into talk of Tyrol, of the Dolomites, of Venice, and, so talking, passed into the dining-room. "Queer little house this, isn't it?" said Mrs. Franks, as she sat down to table. "Everything is sacrificed to the studio. There's no room to turn anywhere else. We must look at once for more comfortable quarters." "It's only meant for a man living alone," said the artist with a laugh. Franks laughed frequently, whether what he said was amusing or not. "Yes, we must find something roomier." "A score of sitters waiting for you, I suppose?" said Warburton. "Oh, several. One of them such an awful phiz that I'm afraid of her. If I make her presentable, it will be my greatest feat yet. But the labourer is worthy of his hire, you know, and this bit of beauty-making will have its price." "You know how to interpret that, Mr. Warburton," said Rosamond, with a discreetly confidential smile. "Norbert asks very much less than any other portrait painter of his reputation would." "He'll grow out of that bad habit," Will replied. His note was one of joviality, almost of bluffness. "I'm not sure that I wish him to," said the painter's wife, her eyes straying as if in a sudden dreaminess. "It's a distinction nowadays not to care for money. Norbert jokes about making an ugly woman beautiful," she went on earnestly, "but what he will really do is to discover the very best aspect of the face, and so make something much more than an ordinary likeness." Franks fidgeted, his head bent over his plate. "That's the work of the great artist!" exclaimed Warburton, boldly flattering. "Humbug!" growled Franks, but at once he laughed and glanced nervously at his wife. Though this was Rosamond's only direct utterance on the subject, Warburton discovered from the course of the conversation that she wished to be known as her husband's fervent admirer, that she took him with the utmost seriousness, and was resolved that everybody else should do so. The "great artist" phrase gave her genuine pleasure. She rewarded Will with the kindest look of her beautiful eyes, and from that moment appeared to experience a relief, so that her talk flowed more naturally. Luncheon over, they returned to the studio, where the men lit their pipes, while Rosamond, at her husband's entreaty, exhibited the sketches she had brought home. "Why didn't you let me hear from you?" asked Warburton. "I got nothing but that flimsy postcard from Venice." "Why, I was always meaning to write," answered the artist. "I know it was too bad, but time goes so quickly. With you, no doubt. But if you stood behind a counter all day—" Will saw the listeners exchange a startled glance, followed by an artificial smile. There was an instant's dead silence. "Behind a counter?" fell from Norbert, as if he failed to understand. "The counter, my counter!" shouted Will blusterously. "You know very well what I mean. Your wife has told you all about it." Rosamond flushed and could not raise her eyes. "We didn't know," said Franks, with his nervous little laugh, "whether you cared to talk about it. I'll talk about it with anyone you like. So you do know. That's all right. I still owe my apology to Mrs. Franks for having given her such a shock. The disclosure was really too sudden." "It is I who should beg you to forgive me, Mr. Warburton," replied Rosamond in her sweetest accents. "I behaved in a very silly way, but my friend Bertha Cross treated me as I deserved. She declared that she was ashamed of me. But pray do not think me worse than I was. I ran away really because I felt I had surprised a secret. I was embarrassed. I lost my head. I'm sure you don't think me capable of really mean feelings." "But, old man," put in the artist, in a half-pained voice, "what the deuce does it all mean? Tell us the whole story, do." Will told it, jestingly, effectively. "I was quite sure," sounded, at the close, in Rosamond's voice of tender sympathy, "that you had some noble motive. I said so at once to Bertha." "I suppose," said Will, "Miss Cross will never dare to enter the shop again." "She doesn't come?" "Never since," he answered laughingly. "Her mother has been once or twice, and seems to regard me with a very suspicious eye. Mrs. Cross was told, no doubt?" "That I really can't say," replied Rosamond, averting her eyes. "But doesn't it do one good to hear such a story, Norbert?" she added impulsively. "Yes, that's pluck," replied her husband, with the old spontaneity, in his eyes the old honest look, which hitherto had somehow been a little obscured. "I know very well that I couldn't have done it." Warburton had not looked at Rosamond since her explanation and apology. He was afraid of meeting her eyes, afraid as a generous man who shrinks from inflicting humiliation. For was it conceivable that Rosamond could support his gaze without feeling humiliated? Remembering what had preceded that discovery at the shop, bearing in mind what had followed upon it, he reflected with astonishment on the terms of her self-reproach. It sounded so genuine. To the ears of her husband it must have been purest, womanliest sincerity. As though she could read his thoughts, Rosamond addressed him again in the most naturally playful tone. "And you have been in the Basque country since we saw you? I'm so glad you really took your holiday there at last. You often used to speak of doing so. And you met my sister. Winifred wrote to me all about it. The Coppingers were delighted to see you. Don't you think them nice people? Didn't poor Mrs. Coppinger seem any better?" In spite of himself, Will encountered her look, met the beautiful eyes, felt their smile envelop him. Never till now had he known the passive strength of woman, that characteristic which at times makes her a force of nature rather than an individual being. Amazed, abashed, he let his head fall, and mumbled something about Mrs. Coppinger's state of health. He did not stay much longer. When he took his leave, it would have seemed natural if Franks had come out to walk a little way with him, but his friend bore him company only to the door. "Let us see you as often as possible, old man. I hope you'll often come and lunch on Sunday. Nothing could please us better." Frank's hand grip was very cordial. The look and tone were affectionate. But Will said to himself that the old intimacy was at an end. It must now give place to mere acquaintanceship. He suspected that Franks was afraid to come out and walk with him, afraid that it might not please his wife. That Rosamond was to rule, very sweetly of course, but unmistakably, no one could doubt who saw the two together for 5 minutes. It would be, in all likelihood, a happy subjugation, for Norbert was of anything but a rebellious temper. His bonds would be of silk. The rewards of his docility would be such as many a self-assertive man might envy. But when Warburton tried to imagine himself in such a position, a choked laugh of humorous disdain heaved his chest. He wandered homewards in a dream. He relived those moments on the embankment at Chelsea, when his common sense, his reason, his true emotions were defeated by an impulse now scarcely intelligible. He saw himself shot across Europe, like a parcel dispatched by express, and all that fury and rush meaningless as buffoonery at a pantomime. Yet this was how the vast majority of men fell in love, if ever they did so at all. This was the prelude to marriages innumerable, marriages destined to be dull as ditch-water or sour as verjuice. In love, forsooth! Rosamond, at all events, knew the value of that, and had saved him from his own infatuation. He owed her a lifelong gratitude. That evening he reread a long letter from Jane, which had reached him yesterday. His sister gave him a full description of the new home in Suffolk, and told of the arrangement she had made with Miss Winter, whereby, in a 12-month, she would be able to begin earning a little money, and if all went well, before long, would become self-supporting. Could he not run down to see them? Their mother had borne the removal remarkably well, and seemed, indeed, to have a new vigour. Possibly the air might suit her better than at the Hawes. Will mused over this, but had no mind to make the journey just yet. It would be a pain to him to see his mother in that new place. It would shame him to see his sister at work, and to think that all this change was on his account. So he wrote to mother and sister, with more of expressed tenderness than usual, begging them to let him put off his visit yet a few weeks. Presently they would be more settled. But of one thing let them be sure. His daily work was no burden whatever to him, and he hardly knew whether he would care to change it for what was called the greater respectability of labour in an office. His health was good. His spirits could only be disturbed by ill news from those he loved. He promised that at all events he would spend Christmas with them. September went by. One of the Sundays was made memorable by a visit to Ashted. Will had requested Franks to relate in that quarter the story of Mr. Jollyman, and immediately after hearing it, Ralph Pomfret wrote a warm-hearted letter, which made the recipient in Fulham chuckle with contentment. At Ashted he enjoyed himself in the old way, gladdened by the pleasure with which his friends talked of Rosamond's marriage. Mrs. Pomfret took an opportunity of speaking to him apart, a bright smile on her good face. "Of course, we know who did much, if not everything, to bring it about. Rosamond came and told me how beautifully you had pleaded Norbert's cause, and Norbert confided to my husband that, but for you, he would most likely have married a girl he really didn't care about at all. I doubt whether a mere man ever did such a thing so discreetly and successfully before." In October, Will began to waver in his resolve not to go down into Suffolk before Christmas. There came a letter from his mother which deeply moved him. She spoke of old things as well as new, and declared that in her husband and in her children no woman had ever known truer happiness. This was at the middle of the week. Will all but made up his mind to take an early train on the following Sunday. On Friday he wrote to Jane, telling her to expect him, and, as he walked home from the shop that evening, he felt glad that he had overcome the feelings which threatened to make this first visit something of a trial to his self-respect. "There's a telegram awaiting for you, sir," said Mrs. Wick as he entered. The telegram contained 4 words: "Mother ill. Please come." End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of Will Warburton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Will Warburton by George Gissing. Chapter 41. Happen what might in the world beyond her doors, Mrs. Cross led the wonted life of domestic discomfort and querulousness. An interval there had been this summer, a brief, uncertain interval, when something like good temper seemed to struggle with her familiar mood. It was the month or 2 during which Norbert Franks resumed his friendly visitings. Fallen out of Mrs. Cross's good graces since his failure to become her tenant a couple of years ago, the artist had but to present himself again to be forgiven. And when it grew evident that he came to the house on Bertha's account, he rose in higher favour than ever. But this promising state of things abruptly ended. One morning, Bertha, with a twinkle in her eyes, announced the fact of Frank's marriage. Her mother was stricken with indignant amaze. "And you laugh about it?" "It is so amusing," answered Bertha. Mrs. Cross examined her daughter. "I don't understand you," she exclaimed in a tone of irritation. "I do not understand you, Bertha. All I can say is, behaviour more disgraceful I never—" The poor lady's feelings were too much for her. She retreated to her bedroom, and there passed the greater part of the day. But in the evening, curiosity overcame her sullenness. Having obtained as much information about the artist's marriage as Bertha could give her, she relieved herself in an acrimonious criticism of him and Miss Elvan. "I never like to say what I really thought of that girl," were her concluding words. "Now your eyes are opened, of course you'll never see her again." "Why, mother?" asked Bertha. "I'm very glad she married Mr. Franks. I always hoped she would, and felt pretty sure of it." "And you mean to be friends with them both?" "Why not? But don't let us talk about that," Bertha added good-humouredly. "I should only vex you. There's something else I want to tell you, something you'll really be amused to hear." "Your ideas of amusement, Bertha—" "Yes, yes, but listen. It's about Mr. Jollyman. Who do you think Mr. Jollyman really is?" Mrs. Cross heard the story with bent brows and lips severely set. "And why didn't you tell me this before, pray?" "I hardly know," answered the girl, thoughtfully, smiling. "Perhaps because I waited to hear more to make the revelation more complete. But—" "And this," exclaimed Mrs. Cross, "is why you wouldn't go to the shop yesterday?" "Yes," was the frank reply. "I don't think I shall go again." "And pray why not?" Bertha was silent. "There's one very disagreeable thing in your character, Bertha," remarked her mother severely, "and that is your habit of hiding and concealing. To think that you found this out more than a week ago! You're very, very unlike your father. He never kept a thing from me, never for an hour. But you are always full of secrets. It isn't nice. It isn't at all nice." Since her husband's death, Mrs. Cross had never ceased discovering his virtues. When he lived, one of the reproaches with which she constantly soured his existence was that of secretiveness. And Bertha, who knew something and suspected more of the truth in this matter, never felt it so hard to bear with her mother as when Mrs. Cross bestowed such retrospective praise. "I have thought it over," she said quietly, disregarding the reproof, "and on the whole I had rather not go again to the shop." Thereupon Mrs. Cross grew angry, and for half an hour clamoured as to the disadvantage of leaving Jollyman's for another grocer's. In the end she did not leave him, but either went to the shop herself or sent the servant. Great was her curiosity regarding the disguised Mr. Warburton, with whom, after a significant coldness, she gradually resumed her old chatty relations. At length, one day in autumn, Bertha announced to her that she could throw more light on the Jollyman mystery. She had learnt the full explanation of Mr. Warburton's singular proceedings. "From those people, I suppose," said Mrs. Cross, who by this phrase signified Mr. and Mrs. Franks. "Then I don't wish to hear one word of it." But, as though she had not heard this remark, Bertha began her narrative. She seemed to repeat what had been told her with a quiet pleasure. "Well, then," was her mother's comment, "after all, there's nothing disgraceful." "I never thought there was." "Then why have you refused to enter his shop?" "It was awkward," replied Bertha. "No more awkward for you than for me," said Mrs. Cross. "But I've noticed, Bertha, that you are getting rather selfish in some things. I don't of course say in everything, and I think it isn't difficult to guess where that comes from." Soon after Christmas they were left, by a familiar accident, without a servant. The girl who had been with them for the last 6 months somehow contrived to get her box secretly out of the house and disappeared, having just been paid her wages, without warning. Long and loudly did Mrs. Cross rail against this infamous behaviour. The next morning a young woman came to the house and inquired for Mrs. Cross. Bertha, who had opened the door, led her into the dining room and retired. Half an hour later Mrs. Cross came into the parlour beaming. "There now, if that wasn't a good idea! Who do you think sent that girl, Bertha?" "Mr. Jollyman." Bertha kept silence. "I had to go into the shop yesterday, and I happened to speak to Mr. Jollyman of the trouble I had in finding a good servant. It occurred to me that he might just possibly know of someone. He promised to make inquiries, and here at once comes the nicest girl I've seen for a long time. She had to leave her last place because it was too hard. Just fancy, a shop where she had to cook for 16 people and see to 5 bedrooms. No wonder she broke down, poor thing. She's been resting for a month or 2, and she lives in the same house as a person named Mrs. Hopper, who is the sister of the wife of Mr. Jollyman's assistant. And she's quite content with £15. Quite." As she listened, Bertha wrinkled her forehead and grew rather absent. She made no remark until, after a long account of the virtues she had already descried in Martha, this was the girl's name, Mrs. Cross added that of course she must go at once and thank Mr. Jollyman. "I suppose you still address him by that name?" fell from Bertha. "That name? Why, I'd really almost forgotten it wasn't his real name. In any case, I couldn't use the other in the shop, could I?" "Of course not, no." "Now you speak of it, Bertha," pursued Mrs. Cross, "I wonder whether he knows that I know who he is." "Certainly he does." "When one thinks of it, wouldn't it be better, Bertha, for you to go to the shop again now and then? I am afraid the poor man may feel hurt. He must have noticed that you never went again after that discovery, and one really wouldn't like him to think that you were offended." "Offended?" echoed the girl with a laugh. "Offended at what?" "Oh, some people, you know, might think his behaviour strange, using a name that's not his own, and so on." "Some people might, no doubt. But the poor man, as you call him, is probably quite indifferent as to what we think of him." "Don't you think it would be well if you went in and just thanked him for sending the servant?" "Perhaps," replied Bertha carelessly. But she did not go to Mr. Jollyman's, and Mrs. Cross soon forgot the suggestion. Martha entered upon her duties, and discharged them with such zeal, such docility, that her mistress never tired of lauding her. She was a young woman of rather odd appearance, slim and meagre and red-headed, with a never-failing simper on her loose lips, and blue eyes that frequently watered. She had somehow an air of lurking gentility in faded youth. Undeniable as were the good qualities she put forth on this scene of innumerable domestic failures, Bertha could not altogether like her. Submissive to the point of slavishness, she had at times a look which did not harmonise at all with this demeanour, a something in her eyes disagreeably suggestive of mocking insolence. Bertha particularly noticed this on the day after Martha had received her first wages. Leave having been given her to go out in the afternoon to make some purchases, she was rather late in returning, and Bertha, meeting her as she entered, asked her to be as quick as possible in getting tea. Whereupon the domestic threw up her head and regarded the speaker from under her eyelids with an extraordinary smile. Then with a "Yes, miss, this minute, miss," scampered upstairs to take her things off. All that evening her behaviour was strange. As she waited at the supper table, she seemed to be subduing laughter, and in clearing away she for the first time broke a plate, whereupon she burst into tears and begged forgiveness so long and so wearisomely that she had at last to be ordered out of the room. On the morrow all was well again, but Bertha could not help watching that singular countenance, and the more she observed, the less she liked it. The more willing a servant, the more toil did Mrs. Cross exact from her. When occasions of rebuke or of dispute were lacking, the day would have been long and wearisome for her had she not ceaselessly plied the domestic drudge with tasks, and narrowly watched their execution. The spectacle of this slave driving was a constant trial to Bertha's nerves. Now and then she ventured a mild protest, but only with the result of exciting her mother's indignation. In her mood of growing moral discontent, Bertha began to ask herself whether acquiescence in this sordid tyranny was not a culpable weakness, and one day early in the year, a wretched day of east wind, when she saw Martha perched on an outer window sill cleaning panes, she found the courage to utter resolute disapproval. "I don't understand you, Bertha," replied Mrs. Cross, the muscles of her face quivering as they did when she felt her dignity outraged. "What do we engage a servant for? Are the windows to get so dirty we can't see through them?" "They were cleaned not many days ago," said her daughter, "and I think we could manage to see till the weather's less terrible." "My dear, if we managed so as to give the servant no trouble at all, the house would soon be in a pretty state. Be so good as to not interfere. It's really an extraordinary thing that as soon as I find a girl who almost suits me, you begin to try to spoil her. One would think you took a pleasure in making my life miserable." Overwhelmed with floods of reproach, Bertha had either to combat or to retreat. Again her nerves failed her, and she left the room. At dinner that night there was a roast leg of mutton, and as her habit was, Mrs. Cross carved the portion which Martha was to take away for herself. One very small and very thin slice, together with one unwholesome little potato, represented the servant's meal. As soon as the door had closed, Bertha spoke in an ominously quiet voice. "Mother, this won't do. I am very sorry to annoy you, but if you call that a dinner for a girl who works hard 10 or 12 hours a day, I don't. How she supports life I can't understand. You have only to look into her face to see she's starving. I can bear the sight of it no longer." This time she held firm. The conflict lasted for half an hour, during which Mrs. Cross twice threatened to faint. Neither of them ate anything, and in the end Bertha saw herself, if not defeated, at all events no better off than at the beginning, for her mother clung fiercely to authority, and would obviously live in perpetual strife rather than yield an inch. For the next 2 days domestic life was very unpleasant indeed. Mother and daughter exchanged few words. Meanwhile Martha was tasked, if possible, more vigorously than ever, and fed mysteriously, meals no longer doled out to her under Bertha's eyes. The third morning brought another crisis. "I have a letter from Emily," said Bertha at breakfast, naming a friend of hers who lived in the far north of London. "I'm going to see her to-day." "Very well," answered Mrs. Cross, between rigid lips. "She says that in the house where she lives there's a bed-sitting room to let. I think, mother, it might be better for me to take it." "You will do just as you please, Bertha." "I shall have dinner to-day with Emily and be back about tea-time." "I have no doubt," replied Mrs. Cross, "that Martha will be so obliging as to have tea ready for you. If she doesn't feel strong enough, of course, I will see to it myself." End of chapter 41. Chapter 42 of Will Warburton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Will Warburton by George Gissing. Chapter 42. On the evening before, Martha had received her month's wages, and had been promised the usual afternoon of liberty to-day. But, as soon as Bertha had left the house, Mrs. Cross summoned the domestic, and informed her bluntly that the holiday must be postponed. "I'm very sorry, mum," replied Martha, with an odd, half-frightened look in her watery eyes. "I promised to go and see my brother, as has just lost his wife, but of course if it isn't convenient, mum—" "It really is not, Martha. Miss Bertha will be out all day, and I don't like being left alone. You shall go to-morrow instead." Half an hour later, Mrs. Cross went out shopping, and was away till noon. On returning, she found the house full of the odour of something burnt. "What's this smell, Martha?" she asked at the kitchen door. "What is burning?"
"Oh, it's only a dishcloth as was drying and caught fire, mum," answered the servant.
"Only? What do you mean?" cried the mistress angrily. "Do you wish to burn the house down?" Martha stood with her arms akimbo, on her thin, dough-pale face the most insolent of grins, her teeth gleaming, and her eyes wide. "What do you mean?" cried Mrs. Cross. "Show me the burnt cloth at once."
"There you are, mum."
And Martha, with a kick, pointed to something on the floor. Amazed and wrathful, Mrs. Cross saw a long roller towel, half a yard of it burnt to tinder. Nor could any satisfactory explanation of the accident be drawn from Martha, who laughed, sobbed, and sniggered by turns as if she were demented. "Of course you will pay for it!" exclaimed Mrs. Cross for the 20th time. "Go on with your work at once, and don't let me have any more of this extraordinary behaviour. I can't think what has come to you." But Martha seemed incapable of resuming her ordinary calm. Whilst serving the 1 o'clock dinner, which was very badly cooked, she wept and sighed, and when her mistress had risen from the table, she stood for a long time staring vacantly before she could bestir herself to clear away. About 3 o'clock, having several times vainly rung the sitting-room bell, Mrs. Cross went to the kitchen. The door was shut, and, on trying to open it, she found it locked. She called "Martha" again and again, and had no reply, until, all of a sudden, a shrill voice cried from within, "Go away! Go away!" Beside herself with wrath and amazement, the mistress demanded admission. Answer there came a violent thumping on the door at the other side, and again the voice screamed, "Go away! Go away!" "What's the matter with you, Martha?" asked Mrs. Cross, beginning to feel alarmed. "Go away!" replied the voice fiercely. "Either you open the door this moment, or I call a policeman." This threat had an immediate effect, though not quite of the kind that Mrs. Cross hoped. The key turned with a snap, the door was flung open, and there stood Martha, in a corybantic attitude, brandishing a dinner plate in one hand, a poker in the other. Her hair was dishevelled, her face red, and fury blazed in her eyes. "You won't go away?" she screamed. "There, then! There goes one of your plates!" She dashed it to the floor. "You won't go away? There goes one of your dishes, and there goes a basin, and there goes a teacup." One after another, the things she named perished upon the floor. Mrs. Cross stood paralysed, horror-stricken.
"You think you'll make me pay for them?" cried Martha frantically. "Not me, not me! It's you as owes me money for all the work I've done as wasn't in my wages, and for the food as I haven't had when I'd ought to. What do you call that?" She pointed to a plate of something on the kitchen table. "Is that a dinner for a human being, or is it a dinner for a beetle? Do you think I'd eat it, and me with money in my pocket to buy better? You want to make a walking skeleton of me, do you? But I'll have it out of you, I will. There goes another dish, and here goes a sugar basin, and here goes your teapot." With a shriek of dismay, Mrs. Cross sprang forward. She was too late to save the cherished object, and her aggressive movement excited Martha to yet more alarming behaviour. "You'd hit me, would you? Two can play at that game, you old skinflint, you! Come another step nearer, and I'll bring this poker on your head. You thought you'd get somebody you could do as you liked with, didn't you? You thought because I was willing and tried to do my best, as I could be put upon to any extent, did you? It's about time you learnt your mistake, you old cheese-parer. You and me has an account to settle. Let me get at you! Let me get at you!" She brandished the poker so menacingly that Mrs. Cross turned and fled. Martha pursued, yelling abuse and threats. The mistress vainly tried to shut the sitting-room door against her. In broke the furious maid, and for a moment so handled her weapon that Mrs. Cross with difficulty escaped a dangerous blow. Round and round the table they went until, the cloth having been dragged off, Martha's feet caught in it, and she fell heavily to the floor. To escape from the room, the terrified lady must have stepped over her. For a moment there was silence. Then Martha made an attempt to rise, fell again struggled to her knees, and finally collapsed, lying quite still and mute. Trembling, panting, Mrs. Cross moved cautiously nearer until she could see the girl's face. Martha was asleep, unmistakably asleep. She had even begun to snore. Avoiding her contact with as much disgust as fear, Mrs. Cross got out of the room and opened the front door of the house. This way and that she looked along the streets, searching for a policeman, but none was in sight. At this moment approached a familiar figure, Mr. Jollyman's errand boy, basket on arm. He had parcels to deliver here. "Are you going back to the shop at once?" asked Mrs. Cross, after hurriedly setting down the groceries in the passage. "Straight back, mum." "Then run as quickly as ever you can, and tell Mr. Jollyman that I wish to see him immediately. Immediately! Run! Don't lose a moment." Afraid to shut herself in with the sleeping fury, Mrs. Cross remained standing near the front door, which every now and then she opened to look for a policeman. The day was cold. She shivered. She felt weak, wretched, ready to sob in her squalid distress. Some 20 minutes passed, then, just as she opened the door to look about again, a rapid step sounded on the pavement, and there appeared her grocer. "Oh, Mr. Jollyman!" she exclaimed. "What have I just gone through? That girl has gone raving mad. She has broken almost everything in the house and tried to kill me with the poker. Oh, I am so glad you've come. Of course there's never a policeman when they're wanted. Do please come in." Warburton did not at once understand what was meant by "that girl," but when Mrs. Cross threw open the sitting-room door and exhibited her domestic prostrate in disgraceful slumber, the facts of the situation broke upon him. This was the girl so strongly recommended by Mrs. Hopper. "But I thought she had been doing very well." So she had, Mr. Jollyman, except for a few little things. Though there was always something rather strange about her. It's only to-day that she broke out. She's mad, I assure you, raving mad." Another explanation suggested itself to Warburton. "Don't you notice a suspicious odour?" he asked significantly. "You think it's that?" said Mrs. Cross in a horrified whisper. "Oh, I dare say you're right. I'm too agitated to notice anything. Oh, Mr. Jollyman, do help me to get the creature out of the house. How shameful that people gave her a good character. But everybody deceives me. Everybody treats me cruelly, heartlessly. Don't leave me alone with that creature, Mr. Jollyman. Oh, if you knew what I have been through with servants! But never anything so bad as this. Never! Oh, I feel quite ill. I must sit down." Fearful that his situation might become more embarrassing than it was, Warburton supported Mrs. Cross into the dining room, and by dint of loudly cheerful talk in part composed her. She consented to sit with the door locked, whilst her rescuer hurried in search of a policeman. Before long, a constable's tread sounded in the hall. Mrs. Cross told her story, exhibited the ruins of her crockery on the kitchen floor, and demanded instant expulsion of the dangerous rebel. Between them, Warburton and the man in authority shook Martha into consciousness, made her pack her box, put her into a cab, and sent her off to the house where she had lived when out of service, she all the time weeping copiously, and protesting that there was no one in the world so dear to her as her outraged mistress. About an hour was thus consumed. When at length the policeman had withdrawn, and sudden quiet reigned in the house, Mrs. Cross seemed again on the point of fainting. "How can I ever thank you, Mr. Jollyman?" she exclaimed, half hysterically, as she let herself sink into the armchair. "Without you, what would have become of me? Oh, I feel so weak. If I had strength to get myself a cup of tea—" "Let me get it for you," cried Warburton. "Nothing easier. I noticed the kettle by the kitchen fire." "Oh, I cannot allow you, Mr. Jollyman. You're too kind. I feel so ashamed." But Will was already in the kitchen, where he bestirred himself so effectually that in a few minutes the kettle had begun to sing. Just as he went back to the parlour to ask where tea could be found, the front door opened, and in walked Bertha. "Your daughter is here, Mrs. Cross," said Will in an undertone, stepping toward the limp and pallid lady. "Bertha!" she cried. "Bertha! Are you there? Oh, come and thank Mr. Jollyman. If you knew what has happened whilst you were away!" At the room door appeared the girl's astonished face. Warburton's eyes fell upon her. "It's a wonder you find me alive, dear," pursued the mother. "If one of those blows had fallen on my head—" "Let me explain," interposed Warburton quietly, and in a few words he related the events of the afternoon. "And Mr. Jollyman was just getting me a cup of tea, Bertha," added Mrs. Cross. "I do feel ashamed that he should have had such trouble." "Mr. Jollyman has been very kind indeed," said Bertha, with look and tone of grave sincerity. "I'm sure we cannot thank him enough." Warburton smiled as he met her glance. "I feel rather guilty in the matter," he said, "for it was I who suggested the servant. If you will let me, I will do my best to atone by trying to find another and a better." "Run and make the tea, my dear," said Mrs. Cross. "Perhaps Mr. Jollyman will have a cup with us." This invitation was declined. Warburton sought for his hat and took leave of the ladies, Mrs. Cross overwhelming him with gratitude, and Bertha murmuring a few embarrassed words. As soon as he was gone, mother and daughter took hands affectionately, then embraced with more tenderness than for a long, long time. "I shall never dare to live alone with a servant," sobbed Mrs. Cross. "If you leave me, I must go into lodgings, dear." "Hush, hush, mother," replied the girl in her gentlest voice. "Of course I shall not leave you." "Oh, the dreadful things I have been through! It was drink, Bertha. That creature was a drunkard of the most dangerous kind. She did her best to murder me. I wonder I am not at this moment lying dead. Oh, but the kindness of Mr. Jollyman! What a good thing I sent for him! And he speaks of finding us another servant. But, Bertha, I shall never try to manage a servant again, never. I shall always be afraid of them. I shall dread to give the simplest order. You, my dear, must be the mistress of the house. Indeed you must. I give over everything into your hands. I will never interfere. I won't say a word, whatever fault I may have to find. Not a word. Oh, that creature, that horrible woman will haunt my dreams. Bertha, you don't think she'll hang about the house and lie in wait for me, to be revenged?" We must tell the policeman to look out for her. I'm sure I shall never venture to go out alone, and if you leave me in the house with a new servant, even for an hour, I must be in a room with the door locked. My nerves will never recover from this shock. Oh, if you knew how ill I feel! I'll have a cup of tea and then go straight to bed." Whilst she was refreshing herself, she spoke again of Mr. Jollyman. "Do you think I ought to have pressed him to stay, dear? I didn't feel sure." "No, you were quite right not to do so," replied Bertha. "He of course understood that it was better for us to be alone." "I thought he would, really. For a grocer, he is so very gentlemanly." "That's not surprising, mother." No, I'm always forgetting that he isn't a grocer by birth. I think, Bertha, it will only be right to ask him to come to tea some day before long." Bertha reflected, a half smile about her lips. "Certainly," she said, "if you would like to." "I really should. He was so very kind to me, and perhaps, what do you think? Ought we to invite him in his proper name?" "No, I think not," answered Bertha after a moment's reflection. "We are not supposed to know anything about that." "To be sure not. Oh, that dreadful creature! I see her eyes glaring at me like a tiger's. 50 times at least did she chase me round this table. I thought I should have dropped with exhaustion, and if I had, one blow of that poker would have finished me. Never speak to me of servants, Bertha. Engage any one you like, but do be careful to make inquiries about her. I shall never wish even to know her name. I shall never look at her face. I shall never speak a word to her. I leave all the responsibility to you, dear. And now, help me upstairs. I'm sure I could never get up alone. I tremble in every limb." End of chapter 42. Chapter 43 of Will Warburton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Will Warburton by George Gissing. Chapter 43. Warburton's mother was dead. The first effect upon him of the certainty that she could not recover from the unconsciousness in which he found her when summoned by Jane's telegram, was that of an acute remorse. It pierced him to the heart that she should have abandoned the home of her lifetime for the strangeness and discomfort of the new abode, and here have fallen, stricken by death. The cause of it, he himself, he so unworthy of the least sacrifice. He had loved her, but what assurance had he been wont to give her of his love? Through many and many a year it was much if he wrote at long intervals a hurried letter. How seldom had he cared to go down to St. Neot's, and, when there, how soon had he felt impatient of the little restraints imposed upon him by his mother's ways and prejudices. Yet not a moment had she hesitated, ill and aged, when, at so great a cost to herself, it seemed possible to make life a little easier for him. This reproach was the keenest pain with which nature had yet visited him. Something of the same was felt by his sister, partly on her own, partly on his account. But as soon as Jane became aware of his self-torment, her affection and her good sense soon brought succour to them both. She spoke of the life their mother had led since coming into Suffolk, related 100 instances to prove how full of interest and contentment it had been, bore witness to the seeming improvement of health, and the even cheerfulness of spirits which had accompanied it. Moreover, there was the medical assurance that life could not in any case have been prolonged, that change of place and habits counted for nothing in the sudden end which some months ago had been foretold. Jane confessed herself surprised at the ease with which so great and sudden a change was borne, the best proof that could have been given of their mother's nobleness of mind. Only once had Mrs. Warburton seemed to think regretfully of the old home. It was on coming out of church one morning, when, having stood for a moment to look at the graveyard, she murmured to her daughter
that she would wish to be buried at St. Neot's. This, of course, was done. It would have been done even had she not spoken. And when, on the day after the funeral, brother and sister parted to go their several ways, the sadness they bore with them had no embitterment of brooding regret. A little graver than usual, Will took his place behind the counter, with no word to Alchin concerning the cause of his absence. He wrote frequently to Jane, and from her received long letters, which did him good, so redolent were they of the garden life, even in midwinter, and so expressive of a frank, sweet, strong womanhood, like that of her who was no more. Meanwhile his business flourished. Not that he much exerted himself, or greatly rejoiced to see his till more heavily laden night after night. By natural accretion, custom flowed to the shop in fuller stream. Jollyman's had established a reputation for quality and cheapness, and began seriously to affect the trade of small rivals in the district. As Alchin had foretold, the hapless grocer with the drunken wife sank defeated before the end of the year. One morning his shop did not open, and in a few days the furniture of the house was carried off by some brisk creditor. It made Warburton miserable to think of the man's doom, when Alchin, frank barbarian as he was, loudly exulted. Will turned away in shame and anger. Had the thing been practicable, he would have given money out of his own pocket to the ruined struggler. He saw himself as a merciless victor. He seemed to have his heel on the other man's head, and to crush. At Christmas he was obliged to engage a second assistant. Alchin did not conceal his dislike of this step, but he ended by admitting it to be necessary. At first the new state of things did not work quite smoothly. Alchin was inclined to an imperious manner, which the newcomer, by name Gough, now and then plainly resented. But in a day or two they were on fair terms, and ere long they became cordial. Then befell the incident of Mrs. Cross's Martha. Not without uneasiness had Warburton suggested a servant on the recommendation of Mrs. Hopper, but credentials seemed to be fairly good, and when, after a week or two, Mrs. Cross declared herself more than satisfied, he blessed his good luck. Long ago he had ceased to look for the reappearance at the shop of Bertha Cross. He thought of the girl now and then, generally reverting in memory to that day when he had followed her and her mother into Kew Gardens, a recollection which had lost all painfulness and shone idyllically in summer sunlight. But it mattered nothing to him that Bertha showed herself no more. Of course she knew his story from Rosamond, and in all likelihood she felt her self-respect concerned in holding aloof from an acquaintance of his ambiguous standing. It mattered not a jot. Yet, when the tragi-comedy of Martha's outbreak unexpectedly introduced him to the house at Walham Green, he experienced a sudden revival of the emotions of a year ago. After his brief meeting with Bertha, he did not go straight back to the shop, but wandered a little in quiet byways, thinking hard and smiling. Nothing more grotesque than the picture of Mrs. Cross amid her shattered crockery, Mrs. Cross pointing to the prostrate Martha, Mrs. Cross panting forth the chronicle of her woes. But Mrs. Cross's daughter was not involved in this scene of pantomime. She walked across the stage, but independently, with a simple dignity, proof against paltry or ludicrous circumstance. If anyone could see the laughable side of such domestic squalor, assuredly it was Bertha herself. Of that Will felt assured. Did he not remember her smile when she had to discuss prices and qualities in the shop? Not many girls smile with so much implication of humorous comment. He had promised to look out for another servant, but hardly knew how to go to work. First of all, Mrs. Hopper was summoned to an interview in the parlour behind the shop, and Martha's case was fully discussed. With much protesting and circumlocution, Mrs. Hopper brought herself at length to own that Martha had been known to take too much, but that was so long ago, and the girl had solemnly declared, etc., etc. However, as luck would have it, She did know of another girl, a really good general servant, who had only just been thrown out of a place by the death of her mistress, and who was living at home in Kentish Town. Thither sped Warburton. He saw the girl and her mother, and, on returning, sent a note to Mrs. Cross, in which he detailed all he had learned concerning the new applicant. At the close he wrote, "You are aware, I think, that the name under which I do business is not my own. Permit me, in writing to you on a private matter, to use my own signature," which accordingly followed. Moreover, he dated the letter from his lodgings, not from the shop. The next day brought him a reply. He found it on his breakfast table, and broke the envelope with amused curiosity. Mrs. Cross wrote that Sarah Walker had been to see her, and if inquiries proved satisfactory, would be engaged. "We are very greatly obliged for the trouble you have taken. Many thanks for your kind inquiries as to my health. I am glad to say that the worst of the shock has passed away, though I fear that I shall long continue to feel its effects." A few remarks followed on the terrible difficulties of the servant question. Then, "Should you be disengaged on Sunday next, we shall be glad if you will take a cup of tea with us." Over his coffee and egg, Will pondered this invitation. It pleased him undeniably, but caused him no undue excitement. He would have liked to know in what degree Mrs. Cross's daughter was a consenting party to the step. Perhaps she felt that, after the services he had rendered, the least one could do was to invite him to tea. Why should he refuse? Before going to business, he wrote a brief acceptance. During the day, a doubt now and then troubled him as to whether he had behaved discreetly, but on the whole he looked forward to Sunday with pleasant expectation. How should he equip himself? Should he go dressed as he would have gone to the Pomfrets, in his easy walking attire, jacket and soft felt? Or did the circumstances dictate chimney pot and frock coat? He scoffed at himself for fidgeting over the point, yet perhaps it had a certain importance. After deciding for the informal costume, at the last moment he altered his mind, and went arrayed as society demands, with the result that, on entering the little parlour, that name suited it much better than drawing-room, he felt overdressed, pompous, generally absurd. His cylinder seemed to be about 3 feet high, his gloves stared their newness, the tails of his coat felt as though they were wrapped several times round his legs, and still left enough to trail upon the floor as he sat on a chair too low for him. Never since the most awkward stage of boyhood had he felt so little at ease in company, and he had a conviction that Bertha Cross was laughing at him. Her smile was too persistent. It could only be explained as a compromise with threatening merriment. A gap in the conversation prompted Warburton to speak of a little matter which was just now interesting him. It related to Mr. Potts, the shopkeeper in Kennington Lane, whom he used to meet, but of whom for a couple of years and more he had quite lost sight. Stirred by reproach of conscience, he had at length gone to make inquiries, but the name of Potts was no longer over the shop. I went in and asked whether the old man was dead. No, he had retired from business and was lodging not far away. I found the house, a rather grimy place, and the door was opened by a decidedly grimy woman. I saw at once that she didn't care to let me in. What was my business? And so on. But I held firm, and got at last into a room on the second floor, an uncomfortable sitting room, where poor old Potts welcomed me. If only he had known my address, he said, he should have written to tell me the news. His son in America, the one I knew, was doing well, and sent money every month, enough for him to live upon. But was he comfortable in those lodgings? I asked. Of course I saw that he wasn't, and I saw too that my question made him nervous. He looked at the door and spoke in a whisper. The upshot of it was that he had fallen into the hands of a landlady who victimised him. Just because she was an old acquaintance, he didn't feel able to leave her. "Shall I help you to get away?" I asked him, and his face shone with hope. Of course the woman was listening at the keyhole, we both knew that. When I went away, she had run half down the stairs, and I caught her angry look before she hid it with a grin. I must find decent lodgings for the old fellow as soon as possible. He is being bled mercilessly." "How very disgraceful!" exclaimed Mrs. Cross. "Really, the meanness of some women of that class." Her daughter had her eyes cast down, on her lips the faintest suggestion of a smile. "I wonder whether we could hear of anything suitable," pursued her mother, "by inquiring of people we know out at Holloway. I'm thinking of the Boltons, Bertha." Mr. Potts' requirements were discussed, Bertha interesting herself in the matter and making various suggestions. The talk grew more animated. Warburton was led to tell of his own experience in lodgings. Catching Bertha's eye, he gave his humour full scope on the subject of Mrs. Wick, and there was merriment in which even Mrs. Cross made a show of joining. "Why," she exclaimed, "do you stay in such very uncomfortable rooms?" "Doesn't matter," Will replied. "It's only for a time." "Ah, you have other views?" "Yes," he answered, smiling cheerfully. "I have other views." End of chapter 43. Chapter 44 of Will Warburton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Will Warburton by George Gissing. Chapter 44. Toward the end of the following week, Mrs. Cross came to the shop. She had a busy air, and spoke to Warburton in a confidential undertone. "We have been making inquiries, and at last I think we have heard of something that might suit your poor friend. This is the address. My daughter went there this morning and had a long talk with the woman, and she thinks it really might do. But perhaps you have already found something?" "Nothing at all," answered Will. "I am much obliged to you. I will go as soon as possible." "We shall be so glad to hear if it suits," said Mrs. Cross. "Do look in on Sunday, will you? We are always at home at 5 o'clock. Oh, I have written out a little list of things," she added, laying her grocery order on the counter. "Please tell me what they come to." Warburton gravely took the cash, and Mrs. Cross, with her thinly gracious smile, bade him good day. He did not fail to "look in" on Sunday, and this time he wore his ordinary, comfortable clothing. The rooms recommended for Mr. Potts had seemed to him just what were needed, and on his own responsibility he had taken them. Moreover, he had been to Kennington, and had made known to the nervous old man the arrangements that were proposed for him. "But will he be allowed to leave?" asked Bertha, in her eyes the twinkle for which Will watched. "He won't dare, he tells me, to give notice, but he'll only have to pay a week's rent in lieu of it. I have promised to be with him at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning to help him to get away. I shall take my heaviest walking stick. One must be prepared for every emergency. Glance over the police news on Tuesday, Mrs. Cross, just to see whether I have come to harm." "We shall be very anxious indeed," replied the literal lady, with pained brow. "Couldn't you let us hear tomorrow evening? I know only too well what dreadful creatures the women of that class can be. I very strongly advise you, Mr. Warburton, to be accompanied by a policeman. I beg you will." Late on the Monday afternoon, Jollyman's errand boy left a note for Mrs. Cross. It informed her that all had gone well, though not without uproar. The woman shrieked insults from her doorstep after our departing cab. Poor Mr. Potts was all but paralytic with alarm, but came round famously at sight of the new lodgings. He wants to thank you both. It was on this same evening that Warburton had a visit from Godfrey Sherwood. A fortnight ago, just after Easter, had taken place the marriage of Mr. Milligan and Miss Parker, and Sherwood, whilst his chief was absent on the honeymoon, had run down to the seaside for a change of air. To-night he presented himself unexpectedly, and his face was the prologue to a moving tale. "Read that, Warburton." He held out a letter. "Read that, and tell me what you think of human nature." It was a letter from Milligan, who, with many explanations and apologies, wrote to inform his secretary that the great work could not be pursued, that the vegetarian colony in Ireland, which was to civilise the world, must, so far as he was concerned, remain a glorious dream. The fact of the matter was, Mrs. Milligan did not like it. She had tried vegetarianism. It did not suit her health. Moreover, she objected to living in Ireland on account of the dampness of the climate. Sadly, reluctantly, Mrs. Milligan's husband had to forego his noble project. In consequence, he would have no need henceforth of a secretary, and Sherwood must consider their business relations at an end. "He encloses a very liberal cheque," said Godfrey. "But what a downfall! I foresaw it. I hinted my fears to you as soon as Miss Parker appeared on the scene. Poor old Milligan! A lost man, sunk in the commonplace, hopelessly whelmed in vulgar matrimony. Poor old fellow!" Warburton chuckled. "But that isn't all," went on the other. "Old Strangwin is dead, really dead at last. I wrote several times to him. No acknowledgment of my letters. Now it's all over. The £10,000... He made a despairing gesture. Then, "Take that cheque, Warburton. It's all I have. Take it, old fellow, and try to forgive me. You won't? Well, well. If I live, I'll pay you yet. But I'm a good deal run down, and these disappointments have almost floored me. To tell you the truth, the vegetarian diet won't do. I feel as weak as a cat. If you knew the heroism it has cost me, down at the seaside, to refrain from chops and steaks. Now I give it up. Another month of cabbage and lentils, and I should be sunk beyond recovery. I give it up. This very night I shall go and have a supper, a real supper, in town. Will you come with me, old man? What's before me I don't know. I have half a mind to go to Canada as farm labourer. It would be just the thing for my health. But let us go and have one more supper together, as in the old days. Where shall it be?" So they went into town and supped royally, with the result that Warburton had to see his friend home. Over the second bottle, Godfrey decided for an agricultural life in the far west, and Will promised to speak for him to a friend of his, a lady who had brothers farming in British Columbia. But before he went, he must be assured that Warburton really forgave him the loss of that money. Will protested that he had forgotten all about it. If any pardon were needed, he granted it with all his heart, and so with affectionate cordiality they bade each other good night. To his surprise, he received a letter from Sherwood a day or two after, seriously returning to the British Columbia project and reminding him of his promise. So, on Sunday, Will called for the first time without invitation at Mrs. Cross's, and being received with no less friendliness than hitherto, began asking news of Bertha's brothers, whereupon followed talk upon Canadian farming life and the mention of Godfrey Sherwood. Bertha undertook to write on the subject by the next mail. She thought it likely enough that her brothers might be able to put Mr. Sherwood into the way of earning a living. "What do you think we did yesterday?" said Mrs. Cross. "We took the liberty of calling upon Mr. Potts. We had to go and see Mrs. Bolton at Holloway, and as it was so near, we thought we might venture, using your name as our introduction. And the poor old gentleman was delighted to see us, wasn't he, Bertha? Oh, and he is so grateful for our suggestion of the lodgings." Bertha's smile betrayed a little disquiet. Perceiving this, Warburton spoke with emphasis. "It was kind of you. The old man feels a little lonely in that foreign region. He's hardly been out of Kennington for 40 years. A very kind thought indeed." "I'm relieved," said Bertha. "It seemed to me just possible that we had been guilty of a serious indiscretion. Good intentions are very dangerous things." When next Warburton found time to go to Holloway, he heard all about the lady's visit. He learned, moreover, that Mr. Potts had told them the story of his kindness to the sick lad at St. Kitts, and of his first visit to Kennington Lane. End of chapter 44. Chapter 45 of Will Warburton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Will Warburton by George Gissing. Chapter 45. When Bertha, at her mother's request, undertook the control of the house, she knew very well what was before her. During a whole fortnight, Mrs. Cross faithfully adhered to the compact. For the first time in her life, she declared, she was enjoying peace. Feeling much shaken in her nervous system, she rose late, retired early, and, when downstairs, reclined a good deal on the sofa. She professed herself unable to remember the new servant's name, and assumed an air of profound abstraction whenever, "What do you call her?" came into the room. Not a question did she permit herself as to the details of household management. Bertha happening, incautiously, to complain of a certain joint supplied by the butcher, Mrs. Cross turned a dreamy eye upon it and said, in the tone of one who speaks of long ago, "In my time he could always be depended upon for a small shoulder," then dismissed the matter as in no way concerning her. But repose had a restorative effect, and in the third week Mrs. Cross felt the revival of her energies. She was but 53 years old, and in spite of languishing habits, in reality had very fair health. Caring little for books, and not much for society, how was she to pass her time if denied the resource of household affairs? Bertha observed the signs of coming trouble. One morning, her mother came downstairs earlier than usual, and after fidgeting about the room, where her daughter was busy at her drawing board, suddenly exclaimed, "I wish you would tell that girl to make my bed properly. I haven't closed my eyes for 3 nights, and I ache from head to foot. The way she neglects my room is really shameful." There followed intimate details, to which Bertha listened gravely. "That shall be seen to at once, mother," she replied, and left the room. The complaint, as she suspected, had very little foundation. It was only the beginning. Day after day did Mrs. Cross grumble about this, that, and the other thing, until Bertha saw that the anticipated moment was at hand. The great struggle arose out of that old point of debate, the servants' meals. Mrs. Cross, stealing into the kitchen, had caught a glimpse of Sarah's dinner, and so amazed was she, so stirred with indignation to the depth of her soul, that she cast off all show of respect for the new order, and overwhelmed Bertha with rebukes. Her daughter listened quietly until the torrent had spent its force, then said with a smile, "Is this how you keep your promise, mother?" "Promise? Did I promise to look on at wicked waste? Do you want to bring us to the workhouse, child?" "Don't let us waste time in talking about what we settled a month ago," replied Bertha decisively. "Sarah is doing very well, and there must be no change. I am quite content to pay her wages myself. Keep your promise, mother, and let us live quietly and decently." "If you call it living decently to pamper a servant until she bursts with insolence—" "When was Sarah insolent to you? She has never been disrespectful to me. Quite the contrary. I think her a very good servant indeed. You know that I have a good deal of work to do just now, and, to speak quite plainly, I can't let you upset the orderly life of the house. Be quiet, there's a dear. I insist upon it." Speaking thus, Bertha laid her hands on her mother's shoulders, and looked into the foolish, angry face, so steadily, so imperturbably, with such a light of true kindness in her gentle eyes, yet at the same time such resolution about the well-drawn lips, that Mrs. Cross had no choice but to submit. Grumbling, she turned. Sullenly she held her tongue for the rest of the day. But Bertha, at all events for a time, had conquered. The Crosses knew little and saw less of their kith and kin. With her husband's family, Mrs. Cross had naturally been on cold terms from an early period of her married life. She held no communication with any of the name, and always gave Bertha to understand that, in one way or another, the paternal uncles and aunts had behaved very badly. Of her own blood, she had only a brother 10 years younger than herself, who was an estate agent at Worcester. Some 7 years had elapsed since their last meeting, on which occasion Mrs. Cross had a little difference of opinion with her sister-in-law. James Rawlings was now a widower with 3 children, and during the past year or two not unfriendly letters had been exchanged between Worcester and Walham Green. Utterly at a loss for a means of passing her time, Mrs. Cross, in these days of domestic suppression, renewed the correspondence, and was surprised by an invitation to pass a few days at her brother's house. This she made known to Bertha about a week after the decisive struggle. "Of course, you are invited too, but I'm afraid you're too busy." Amused by her mother's obvious wish to go to Worcester unaccompanied, Bertha answered that she really didn't see how she was to spare the time just now. "But I don't like to leave you alone here." Her daughter laughed at this scruple. She was just as glad of the prospect of a week's solitude as her mother in the thought of temporary escape from the proximity of pampered Sarah. The matter was soon arranged, and Mrs. Cross left home. This was a Friday. The next day, sunshine and freedom putting her in holiday mood, Bertha escaped into the country, and had a long ramble like that, a year ago, on which she had encountered Norbert Franks. Sunday morning she spent quietly at home. For the afternoon she had invited a girl friend. About 5 o'clock, as they were having tea, Bertha heard a knock at the front door. She heard the servant go to open, and, a moment after, Sarah announced, "Mr. Warburton." It was the first time that Warburton had found a stranger in the room, and Bertha had no difficulty in reading the unwonted look with which he advanced to shake hands. "No bad news, I hope?" she asked gravely, after presenting him to the other visitor. "Bad news? I thought you looked rather troubled." Her carefully composed features resisted Will's scrutiny. "Do I? I didn't know it, but yes," he added abruptly, "you are right. Something has vexed me, a trifle. Look at these drawings of Miss Medwin's. They will make you forget all vexatious trifles." Miss Medwin was, like Bertha, a book illustrator, and had brought work to show her friend. Warburton glanced at the drawings with a decent show of interest. Presently he inquired after Mrs. Cross, and learnt that she was out of town for a week or so. At once his countenance brightened, and so shamelessly that Bertha had to look aside, lest her disposition to laugh should be observed. Conversation of a rather artificial kind went on for half an hour. Then Miss Medwin jumped up and said she must go. Bertha protested, but her friend alleged the necessity of making another call, and took leave. Warburton stood with a hand upon his chair. Bertha, turning back from the door, passed by him and resumed her seat. "A very clever girl," she said, with a glance at the window. "Very, no doubt," said Will, glancing the same way. "Won't you sit down?" "Gladly, if you don't think I am staying too long. I had something I wanted to talk about. That was why I felt glum when I came in and found a stranger here. It is such a long time since I had any part in ordinary society that I'm forgetting how to behave myself." "I must apologise for you to Miss Medwin when I see her next," said Bertha, with drollery in her eyes. "She will understand if you tell her I am only a grocer," remarked Will, looking at a point above her head. "It might complicate things." "Do you know," resumed Warburton, "I feel sure that the Franks will never again invite me to lunch or dine there. Franks is very careful when he asks me to go and see them. He always adds that they'll be alone, quite alone. But that's a privilege. So it may be taken. But would it surprise you if they really preferred to see as little of me as possible? Bertha hesitated, smiling, and said at length, with a certain good-humoured irony, "I think I should understand." "So do I, quite," exclaimed Will, laughing. "I wanted to tell you that I've been looking about me, trying to find some way of getting out of the shop. It isn't so easy. I might get a clerkship at a couple of pounds a week, but that doesn't strike me as preferable to my present position. I've been corresponding with Applegarth, the jam manufacturer, and he very strongly advises me to stick to trade. I'm not sure that he isn't right." There was silence. Each sat with drooping eyes. "Do you know," Warburton then asked, "why I turned grocer?" "Yes." "It was a fortunate idea. I don't see how else I should have made enough money these 3 years to pay the income I owed to my mother and sister, and to support myself. Since my mother's death—" Her look arrested him. "I am forgetting that you could not have known of that. She died last autumn. By my father's will, our old house at St. Neots then became mine. It's let. The rent goes to my sister, and out of the shop profits I easily make up what her own part of the lost capital used to yield. Jane is going in for horticulture, making a business of what was always her chief pleasure, and before long she may be independent. But it would be shabby to get rid of my responsibilities at her expense. Don't you think so?" "Worse than shabby." "Good. I like to hear you speak so decidedly. Now, if you please," his own voice was not quite steady, "tell me in the same tone whether you agree with Applegarth, whether you think I should do better to stick to the shop and not worry with looking for a more respectable employment." Bertha seemed to reflect for a moment, smiling soberly. "It depends entirely on how you feel about it." "Not entirely," said Warburton, his features nervously rigid. "But first let me tell you how I do feel about it. You know I began shopkeeping as if I were ashamed of myself. I kept it a dead secret, hid away from everybody, told elaborate lies to my people, and the result was what might have been expected. Before long I sank into a vile hypochondria, saw everything black or dirty grey, thought life intolerable. When common sense found out what was the matter with me, I resolved to have done with snobbery and lying. But a sanguine friend of mine, the only one in my confidence, made me believe that something was going to happen, in fact, the recovery of the lost thousands, and I foolishly held on for a time. Since the awful truth has been divulged, I have felt a different man. I can't say that I glory in grocerdom, but the plain fact is that I see nothing degrading in it, and I do my day's work as a matter of course. Is it worse to stand behind a counter than to sit in a counting-house? Why should retail trade be vulgar and wholesale quite reputable? This is what I've come to, as far as my own thought and feeling go." "Then," said Bertha after a moment's pause, "why trouble yourself any more?" "Because—" His throat turned so dry that he had to stop with a gasp. His fingers were doing their best to destroy the tassels on the arm of his easy chair. With an effort he jerked out the next words. "One may be content to be a grocer, but what about one's wife?" With head bent, so that her smile was half concealed, Bertha answered softly, "Ah, that's a question." End of chapter 45. Chapter 46 of Will Warburton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Will Warburton by George Gissing. Chapter 46. After he had put the question, the reply to which meant so much to him, Will's eyes, avoiding Bertha, turned to the window. Though there wanted still a couple of hours to sunset, a sky overcast was already dusking the little parlour. Distant bells made summons to evening service, and footfalls sounded in the otherwise silent street. "It is a question," he resumed, "which has troubled me for a long time. Do you remember, when was it? A year ago, going one Sunday with Mrs. Cross to Kew?" "I remember it very well." "I happened to be at Kew that day," Will continued, still nervously. "You passed me as I stood on the bridge. I saw you go into the gardens, and I said to myself how pleasant it would be if I could have ventured to join you in your walk. You knew me, as your grocer. For me to have approached and spoken would have been an outrage. That day I had villainous thoughts." Bertha raised her eyes, just raised them till they met his, then bent her head again. "We thought your name was really Jollyman," she said, in a half-apologetic tone. "Of course you did. A good invention, by the by, that name, wasn't it?" "Very good indeed," she answered, smiling. "And you used to come to the shop," pursued Will. "And I looked forward to it. There was something human in your way of talking to me." "I hope so. Yes, but it made me ask myself that question. I comforted myself by saying that of course the shop was only a temporary expedient. I should get out of it. I should find another way of making money. But, you see, I am as far from that as ever, and if I decide to go on shopkeeping, don't I condemn myself to solitude?" "It is a difficulty," said Bertha, in the tone of one who lightly ponders an abstract question. "Now and then, some time ago, I half persuaded myself that, even though a difficulty, it needn't be a fatal one." He was speaking now with his eyes steadily fixed upon her. "But that was when you still came to the shop. Suddenly you ceased." His voice dropped. In the silence, Bertha uttered a little "Yes." "I've been wondering what that meant." His speech was a mere parched gasp. Bertha looked at him, and her eyebrows contracted as if in sympathetic trouble. Gently she asked, "No explanation occurred to you?" With a convulsive movement Will changed his position, and by so doing seemed to have released his tongue. "Several," he said with a strange smile. "The one which most plagued me, I should very likely do better to keep to myself, but I won't. You shall know it. Perhaps you are prepared for it. Do you know that I went abroad last summer?" "I heard of it." "From Miss Elvan?" "From Mrs. Franks." "Mrs. Franks? Yes. She told you, then, that I had been to Saint-Jean-de-Luz. She told you that I had seen her sister?" "Yes," replied Bertha, and added quickly, "You had long wished to see that part of France." "That wasn't my reason for going. I went in a fit of lunacy. I went because I thought Miss Elvan was there. They told me at her Chelsea lodgings that she had gone to Saint-Jean-de-Luz. This was on the day after she came into the shop with you. I had been seeing her. We met here and there, when she was sketching. I went crazy. Don't for a moment think the fault was hers. Don't dream of anything of the kind. I alone, ass, idiot, was to blame. She must have seen what had happened, and, in leaving her lodgings, she purposely gave a false address, never imagining that I was capable of pursuing her across Europe. At Saint-Jean-de-Luz, I heard of her marriage." He stopped, breathless. The short sentences had been flung out explosively. He was hot and red. "Did you suspect anything of all that?" followed in a more restrained tone. "If so, of course I understand." Bertha seemed to be deep in meditation. A faint smile was on her lips. She made no answer. "Are you saying to yourself," Will went on vehemently, "that, Instead of merely being a foolish man, I have shown myself to be shameless. It was foolish, no doubt, to dream that an educated girl might marry a grocer. But when he begins his suit by telling such a story as this, perhaps I needn't have told it at all. Perhaps you had never had a suspicion of such things. All the same, it is better so. I have had enough of lies to last me for all my life. But now that I've told you, try to believe something else, and that is, that I never loved Rosamond Elvan. Never, never. Bertha seemed on the point of laughing, but she drew in her breath, composed her features, let her eyes wander to a picture on the wall. "Can you believe that?" Will asked, his voice quivering with earnestness as he bent forward to her. "I should have to think about it," was the answer, calm, friendly. "The fit of madness from which I suffered is very common in men. Often it has serious results. No end of marriages come about in that way. Happily I was in no danger of that. I simply made a most colossal fool of myself. And all the time, I tell you, believe it or not, as you will or can, I was in love with you." Again Bertha drew in her breath, more softly than before. "I went one day from Saint-Jean-de-Luz over the border into Spain, and came to a village among the mountains called Vera, and there my madness left me. And I thought of you all the way back to Saint-Jean-de-Luz, thought of you as I had been accustomed to do in England, as if nothing had happened. Do you think it pained me then that Rosamond was Mrs. Franks? No more than if I had never seen her. By that time, fresh air and exercise were doing their work, and at Vera I stood a sane man once more. I find it hard to believe now that I really behaved in that frantic way. Do you remember coming once to the shop to ask for a box to send to America? As you talked to me that morning, I knew what I know better still now, that there was no girl that I liked as I liked you, no girl whose face had so much meaning for me, whose voice and way of speaking so satisfied me. But you don't understand. I can't express it. It sounds stupid." "I understand very well," said Bertha, once more on the impartial note. "But the other thing, my insanity?" "I should have to think about that," she answered, with a twinkle in her eyes. Will paused a moment, then asked in a shamefaced way, "Did you suspect anything of the sort?" Bertha moved her head as if to reply, but after all kept silence. Thereupon Warburton stood up and clutched his hat. "Will you let me see you again? Soon? May I come some afternoon in this week and take my chance of finding you at home? Don't answer. I shall come, and you have only to refuse me at the door. It's only an importunate tradesman." Without shaking hands, he turned and left the room. Dreamily he walked homewards. Dreamily, often with a smile upon his face, he sat through the evening. Now and then he pretended to read, but always in a few minutes forgetting the page before him. He slept well. He arose in a cheerful but still dreamy mood, and without a thought of reluctance he went to his day's work. Alchin met him with a long-drawn face, saying, "She's dead, sir." He spoke of his consumptive sister-in-law, whom Warburton had befriended, but whom nothing had availed to save. "Poor girl," said Will kindly, "it is the end of much suffering." "That's what I say, sir," assented Alchin. "And poor Mrs. Hopper, she's fair worn out with nursing her. Nobody can feel sorry." Warburton turned to his correspondence. The next day, at about 4 o'clock, he again called at the Crosses. Without hesitation, the servant admitted him, and he found Bertha seated at her drawing. A little gravely, perhaps, but not at all inhospitably, she rose and offered her hand. "Forgive me," he began, "for coming again so soon." "Tell me what you think of this idea of a book cover," said Bertha, before he had ceased speaking. He inspected the drawing, found it pretty, yet ventured one or two objections, and Bertha, after smiling to herself for a little, declared that he had found the weak points. "You are really fond of this work?" asked Will. "You would be sorry to give it up?" "Think of the world's loss," Bertha answered with raised eyebrows. He sat down and kept a short silence, whilst the girl resumed her pencil. "There were things I ought to have told you on Sunday." Will's voice threatened huskiness. "Things I forgot. That's why I have come again so soon. I ought to have told you much more about myself. How can you know my character, my peculiarities, faults? I've been going over all that. I don't think I'm ill-tempered, or unjust, or violent, but there are things that irritate me. Unpunctuality, for instance. Dinner 10 minutes late makes me fume. Failure to keep an appointment makes me hate a person. I'm rather a grumbler about food. Can't stand a potato ill-boiled or an underdone chop. Then, yes, restraint is intolerable to me. I must come and go at my own will. I must do and refrain just as I think fit. One enormous advantage of my shopkeeping is that I'm my own master. I can't subordinate myself, won't be ruled. Fault-finding would exasperate me. Dictation would madden me. Then, yes, the money matter. I am not extravagant, but I hate parsimony. If it pleases me to give away a sovereign, I must be free to do it. Then, yes, I am not very tidy in my habits. I have no respect for furniture. I like, when it's comfortable, to sit with my boots on the fender, and I loathe antimacassars. In the room were 2 or 3 of these articles, dear to Mrs. Cross. Bertha glanced at them, then bent her head and bit the end of her pencil. "You can't think of anything else?" she asked, when Will had been silent for a few seconds. "Those are my most serious points." He rose. "I only came to tell you of them, that you might add them to the objection of the shop." Bertha also rose. He moved toward her to take leave. "You will think—" Turning halfway, Bertha covered her face with her hands, like a child who is bidden not to look. So she stood for a moment, then, facing Will again, said, "I have thought." "And?" "There is only one thing I am sorry for, that you are nothing worse than a grocer. A grocer's is such a clean, dainty, aromatic trade. Now, if you kept an oil shop, there would be some credit in overlooking it. And you are so little even of a grocer that I should constantly forget it. I should think of you simply as a very honest man, the most honest man I ever knew." Warburton's face glowed. Should, he murmured. "Can't it be shall?" And Bertha, smiling now without a touch of roguishness, smiling in the mere joy of her heart, laid a hand in his. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of Will Warburton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Will Warburton by George Gissing. Chapter 47. When Mrs. Cross came home, she brought with her a changed countenance. The lines graven by habitual fretfulness and sourness of temper, by long-indulged vices of the feminine will, could not, of course, be obliterated, but her complexion had a healthier tone, her eyes were brighter, and the smile with which she answered Bertha's welcome expressed a more spontaneous kindliness than had appeared on her face for many a year. She had recovered, indeed, during her visit to the home of her childhood, something of the grace and virtue in which she was not lacking before her marriage to a man who spoilt her by excess of good nature. Subject to a husband firm of will and occasionally rough of tongue, she might have led a fairly happy and useful life. It was the perception of this truth which had strengthened Bertha in her ultimate revolt. Perhaps, too, it had not been without influence on her own feeling and behaviour during the past week. Mrs. Cross had much to relate. At the tea table she told all about her brother's household, described the children, lauded the cook and housemaid. "Ah, Bertha, if one could get such servants here, but London ruins them." James Rawlings was well-to-do. He lived in a nice, comfortable way, in a pretty house just outside the town. "Oh, and the air, Bertha! I hadn't been there a day before I felt a different creature." James had been kindness itself. Not a word about old differences. He regretted that his niece had not come, but she must come very soon. And the children, Alice, Tom, and little Hilda, so well behaved, so intelligent. She had brought photographs of them all. She had brought presents, all sorts of things. After tea, gossip continued. Speaking of the ages of the children, the eldest 8, the youngest 4, Mrs. Cross regretted their motherless state. A lady nurse had care of them, but with this person their father was not quite satisfied. He spoke of making a change. And here Mrs. Cross paused, with a little laugh. "Perhaps uncle thinks of marrying again?" said Bertha. "Not a bit of it, my dear," replied her mother eagerly. "He expressly told me that he should never do that. I shouldn't wonder if... But let bygones be bygones. No, he spoke of something quite different. Last night we were talking, when the children had gone to bed, and all at once he startled me by saying, 'If only you could come and keep house for me.' The idea!" "Wonderfully good idea, it seems to me," said Bertha reflectively. "But how is it possible, Bertha? Are you serious?" "Quite. I think it might be the very best thing for you. You need something to do, mother. If Uncle James really wishes it, you ought certainly to accept." Fluttered, not knowing whether to look pleased or offended, surprised at her daughter's decisiveness, Mrs. Cross began urging objections. She doubted whether James was quite in earnest. He had admitted that Bertha could not be left alone, yet she could hardly go and live in his house as well. "Oh, don't trouble about me, mother," said the listener. "Nothing is simpler." "But what would you do?" "Oh, there are all sorts of possibilities. At the worst—" Bertha paused for a moment, face averted and lips roguish. "I could get married." And so the disclosure came about. Mrs. Cross seemed so startled as to be almost pained. One would have thought that no remotest possibility of such a thing had ever occurred to her. "Then Mr. Warburton has found a position?" she asked at length. "No, he keeps to the shop." "But, my dear, you don't mean to tell me—" The question ended in a mere gasp. Mrs. Cross's eyes were darkened with incredulous horror. "Yes," said Bertha calmly, pleasantly. "We have decided that there's no choice. The business is a very good one. It improves from day to day. Now that there are 2 assistants, Mr. Warburton need not work so hard as he used to." "But, my dearest Bertha, you mean to say that you're going to be the wife of a grocer?" "Yes, mother. I really have made up my mind to it. After all, is it so very disgraceful?" "What will your friends say? What will—" "Mrs. Grundy?" interposed Bertha. "I was going to say Mrs. Franks." Bertha nodded and answered laughingly, "That's very much the same thing, I'm afraid." End of chapter 47. Chapter 48 of Will Warburton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Will Warburton by George Gissing. Chapter 48. Norbert Franks was putting the last touches to a portrait of his wife, a serious portrait, full length, likely to be regarded as one of his most important works. Now and then he glanced at the original, who sat reading. His eye was dull, his hand moved mechanically. He hummed a monotonous air. Rosamond, having come to the end of her book, closed it and looked up. "Will that do?" she asked, after suppressing a little yawn. The painter merely nodded. She came to his side and contemplated the picture, inclining her head this way and that, with an air of satisfaction. "Better than the old canvas I put my foot through, don't you think?" asked Franks. "Of course, there's no comparison. You've developed wonderfully. In those days—" Franks waited for the rest of the remark, but his wife lost herself in contemplation of the portrait. Assuredly, he had done nothing more remarkable in the way of bold flattery. Anyone who had seen Mrs. Franks only once or twice, and at her best, might accept the painting as a fair interpretation of her undeniable beauty. Those who knew her well would stand bewildered before such a counterfeit presentment. "Old Warburton must come and see it," said the artist presently. Rosamond uttered a careless assent. Long since she had ceased to wonder whether Norbert harboured any suspicions concerning his friend's brief holiday in the south of France. Obviously he knew nothing of the dramatic moment which had preceded and brought about his marriage, nor would he ever know. "I really ought to go and look him up," Franks added. "I keep on saying I'll go tomorrow and tomorrow. Anyone else would think me an ungrateful snob, but old Warburton is too good a fellow. To tell the truth, I feel a little ashamed when I think of how he's living. He ought to have a percentage on my income. What would have become of me if he hadn't put his hand into his pocket when he was well off and I was a beggar?" "But don't you think his business must be profitable?" asked Rosamond, her thoughts only half attentive to the subject. "The old chap isn't much of a businessman, I fancy," Franks answered with a smile, "and he has his mother and sister to support. And no doubt he's always giving away money. His lodgings are miserable. It makes me uncomfortable to go there. Suppose we ask him to lunch on Sunday?" Rosamond reflected for a moment. "If you like. I had thought of asking the Fitzjames girls." "You don't think we might have him at the same time?" Rosamond pursed her lips a little, averting her eyes as she answered. "Would he care for it? And he said, didn't he, that he meant to tell everybody, everywhere, how he earned his living? Wouldn't it be just a little—" Franks laughed uneasily. "Yes, it might be just a little. Well, he must come and see the picture quietly. And I'll go and look up the poor old fellow tonight. I really will." This time the purpose was carried out. Franks returned a little after midnight, and was surprised to find Rosamond sitting in the studio. A friend had looked in late in the evening, she said, and had stayed talking. All about her husband's pictures, so tiresome. She thinks them monuments of genius. "His last thing isn't half bad," said Franks good-naturedly. "Perhaps not. Of course I pretended to think him the greatest painter of modern times. Nothing else will satisfy the silly little woman. You found Mr. Warburton?" Franks nodded, smiling mysteriously. "I have news for you." Knitting her brows a little, his wife looked interrogation. "He's going to be married. Guess to whom?" "Not to—" "Well?" "Bertha Cross?" Again Franks nodded and laughed. An odd smile rose to his wife's lips. She mused for a moment, then asked, "And what position has he got?" "Position? His position behind the counter, that's all. Says he shan't budge. By the by, his mother died last autumn. He's in easier circumstances. The shop does well, it seems. He thought of trying for something else, but talked it over with Bertha Cross, and they decided to stick to groceries. They'll live in the house at Walham Green. Mrs. Cross is going away, to keep house for a brother of hers. Rosamond heaved a sigh, murmuring, "Poor Bertha." "A grocer's wife," said Franks, his eyes wandering. "Oh, confound it! Really, you know—" He took an impatient turn across the floor. Again his wife sighed and murmured, "Poor Bertha." "Of course," said Franks, coming to a pause. "There's a good deal to be said for sticking to a business which yields a decent income and promises much more." "Money?" exclaimed Rosamond scornfully. "What is money?" "We find it useful," quietly remarked the other. "Certainly we do. But you are an artist, Norbert, and money is only an accident of your career. Do we ever talk about it or think about it? Poor Bertha, with her talent." The artist paced about, his hands in his jacket pockets. He was smiling uneasily. "Did you know anything of this kind was going on?" he asked, without looking at his wife. "I had heard nothing whatever. It's ages since Bertha was here." "Yet you don't seem very much surprised." "And you?" asked Rosamond, meeting his eyes. "Were you profoundly astonished?" "Why, yes. It came very unexpectedly. I had no idea they saw each other, except in the shop." "And it vexes you?" said Rosamond, her eyes upon his face. "Vexes? Oh, I can't say that." He fidgeted, turned about, laughed. "Why should it vex me? After all, Warburton is such a thoroughly good fellow, and if he makes money—" "Money?" "We do find it useful, you know," insisted Franks, with a certain obstinacy. Rosamond was standing before the picture and gazing at it. That she should have no higher ambition! Poor Bertha! "We can't all achieve ambitions," cried Franks from the other end of the room. "Not every girl can marry a popular portrait painter." "Great artist!" exclaimed his wife, with emphasis. As she moved slowly away, she kept her look still turned upon the face which smiled from the easel. Watching her tremulous eyebrows, her uncertain lips, one might have fancied that Rosamond sought the solution of some troublesome doubt, and hoped, only hoped, to find it in that image of herself so daringly glorified. End of chapter 48. End of Will Warburton by George Gissing.